A special interview with Thea Halo, author of the book Not Even My Name, and Vivian Linou. The author talks about her mother's story, who was the only survivor in the family after the expulsion from their village in Pontos.
This is from my book, Not Even My Name, and this is in my mother's voice. She's talking about when her mother gave her away to save her life. So this is chapter 22, The Great Giveaway. Sometime in the afternoon, when the sun had already heated the air so hot our breath evaporated even before it left our bodies, and the roads of hard baked soil burned our feet through our calluses, we arrived at the edge of the town called Karabash. Nastasia had died in my arms there, and for the first time I looked around as we approached. The walls of many of the homes were broken down. Sometimes only a wall or two remained, and if one was lucky, part of a roof. We moved into the same abandoned church we had slept in on the way south a few days before. To our surprise, other Greeks from our villages were already there occupying the ruins. Our priest was also there. Each family took a room, or at least a corner of a room. As soon as we put down our bags in the church, Mother said, "I must go and find food." "Where will you find food?" Father said. "I will go and beg for it. The children need food, and Mathia is sick." "I'll come too," I said. I grabbed her arm and pressed myself close to her. The houses we passed looked like they housed people almost as poor as we were. We walked on past them, perhaps not having the heart to knock on their doors to beg. We walked until we came to a field on the edge of the town. Mother ran to it and threw herself on the ground. She dug into the hard soil with her bare hands until she pulled from it a few roots. She stuffed them into her pockets and dug some more. How desperate that gesture of her body, bent over the ground, kneeling on both knees and clawing the hard, dry soil until her nails were filled with earth and her calloused fingers assumed its color.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Vivian Linou, and I'm here with Thea Halo, author of the magnificent book, Not Even My Name. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about the book, Not Even My Name.
Well, in 1989, I decided to take my mother back to Turkey to find her home. I made a promise to her when I was a child that I would do that, when she told me some of her stories. And so in 1989 we did that, and I thought I was taking her on her journey. But it was only when I stood on that land that I realized the journey was also mine. And I felt connected to my heritage and my people for the first time. And then I really wanted to know what happened to her and what her life was like. And so in 1992 I began to write her story. And this is the product of it took us 7 years from beginning to getting published. But we put together this book with her just telling me how she lived in the mountains, in the Pontic Mountains, and then of course the death march to exile and her life in America.
I'm sure you learned a lot of things along the way.
I learned everything along the way. I knew nothing about her childhood, really. I knew a few things. She used to tell us, for instance, how the Greeks bleached the cloth after they wove it by laying it on the ground and putting cow manure, because the uric acid in the cow manure would bleach the cloth white, and then they'd wash it over and over again. So she would tell us little traditions like that. But otherwise, I really knew very little about her life.
I wanted to ask you, what is it like to know of all of this and to being able to write in such a way where, just so much emotion comes out in this book, of which people, I mean, if you read it, it really does. How does it make you feel knowing that you're able to write this book through your mother and publish it?
One of the things that I realized, I don't know how many people believe in fate, but I was a painter before I wrote this book, not a writer. I've always read very, very fine literature from a very, very early age. I started with Homer at the age of 14, and then I went to the Russians. And so I had really a a pretty well-rounded knowledge of really fine literature. And it did two things for me. It not only enriched my life, but it intimidated me because I thought I could never write so beautifully. And so I wanted, once I knew her story, you know, some of her story, I wanted to write it, but I didn't have the courage to write it. And one day I was walking down the street and someone had thrown away a whole pile of books. And because I love books, I took them. And more than one of them were on how to write.
There you go.
And one of those books, I brought them to my country house, and one of the books, I leafed through it, and it gave me such a perfect example of how to write. And it was just a teacher giving a class of 16-year-olds and giving them an exercise to tell something that happened in their lives. And the examples that, the two versions of this one girl that wrote a page and a half was so brilliant. And I realized that it was such a simple directive. And so I wrote a short story, and I sent it to an agent that I was in contact with. I was making radio plays at the time, and he was giving me permission to use Eudora Welty's play. And he said, "It's beautifully written, but we don't publish one short story. If you ever write a book, let me know." And that gave me the courage to begin writing my mother's story.
So baby steps, but it got you here. How amazing. So how important is it for people to know their roots? This is basically just knowing your roots, knowing where you're going, where you're coming from. And that kind of gives you the insight of where you're going. How important is it to know your roots and where you're from?
Well, I don't know whether I would have answered the same question if we didn't not know our roots for so long. But I remember my sisters, and growing up, my older sisters pretended to be Egyptians. And of course they weren't modern Egyptians because we didn't know who modern Egyptians were. They were ancient Egyptians. And so, of course, I became an ancient Egyptian too. And it was only years later that I realized how important having a heritage must be, because otherwise, why would we feel the need to invent one if it wasn't important? And I realized that it's a way of giving one a kind of foundation, a kind of, I say in my book, it made me realize that I had history. And I had, something that went beyond my own lifetime and my own small life. And it went back basically to the beginning of time. And I think it's very important to give one a place in the world.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. So let's talk about your speech. You're giving a speech at the Hellenic Museum. Tell me about that.
Well, I call it memoir, the importance of this memoir, the soul of history, the importance of the personal narrative. And I think the personal narrative is really probably one of the most important ways of our gaining knowledge of history, because it not only tells the details of what happens in a person's life, it tells, how people lived and ate and slept and in the case of genocide, actually how they pieced together their shattered lives. Historians usually give the bigger picture of what happened. And if we're lucky, they also give an analysis. And this is really very important. But they often don't have access to the details of the lives of the people that actually lived it. One of the important things that I think my mother gives us in her narrative is how the Greeks, even though they were only Greeks in her 3 villages she lived in, they were surrounded by Turkish villages. And they lived side by side. And because many of the Turks were poor, and her parents were blacksmiths, her father was a blacksmith, they would bargain. And they would come and they would get their tools either made or repaired. And because they didn't have money, they would pay it off by working in the fields during planting time. So they bartered together. And they lived side by side very peacefully. In today's atmosphere, with so much hatred and Islamophobia, it's important to know those things, that it wasn't, that the Turks were not just horrible, hateful people that were going around killing people. This was not true. My mother always said, you have to blame the Turkish government, not the Turkish people, because it was the Turkish government that instigated this and pushed them to do what they did to us. So this is something that we get from the narrative of people that actually lived through these histories.
It's so funny you say that because, sometimes I would meet, people that are from Turkey and I'll tell them that I'm from Greece and automatically they would say, don't hate me. There's, and it's a joke, obviously, and there's no reason for me to judge or to hate, someone that's from Turkey. But it's just still funny that, the history kind of still lingers on in today's society. So it's still around, for sure.
When I took my mother back to Turkey, I can't tell you how wonderful everybody was to us, everybody. We didn't have one negative experience in all the time we were there. Young boys usually love foreigners. They love to, be around foreigners. Mm-hmm. And they would show us around. And it was interesting because, of course, I'm much younger than my mother. And you would think that young men would, even though they weren't interested in me as a woman, but they would still want to be with a younger person. It was never the case. There was always one boy that stayed with my mother and one boy that stayed with me. They would fan her when she was too hot.
We need those people here now.
They would help her across the street. I mean, they were just so kind and sweet, these young men,
So nice.
And
so
she
nice.
felt that she was home, She was so happy to be.
What should we know about the workshop?
I think this is a teacher's guide. This is a way of helping teachers teach the history of what happened in the Ottoman Empire. Not only the history of the genocide, but also what the whole history of I guess the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. They came in 1200 BC, so they were there for many, many years, thousands of years before the Turkish tribes invaded. And it's a way of, teaching our younger generations that this is not, that what we see today has a much longer history, and that I think that it's important for us to know that and to know how things evolve in the world, sometimes very cruelly. But it's important to know where we come from.
Thea Halo, you belong in a generation where your family has experienced genocide firsthand. So I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask you, what is the first stage of genocide?
Sometimes the first stages of genocide, in the case of the Ottomans against the Greeks, was boycotting, actually. They boycotted businesses and shipping, and then, of course, demonizing the Greeks, talking about them as if they were murderers and thieves and etc. George Horton claimed that the Turkish government was splicing together images to make it appear as if Greeks were killing Turkish babies and slicing open the stomachs of Muslim women to incite the Turkish people to make violence against the Greek population. So little things that they did. There were also speeches saying that all of this land, all of these houses, all this property belonged to you once, and these Gior, these infidels, came and they took it from you, and they were your slaves and now they're your masters. So it portrayed them as kind of evil and as other, that they weren't really co-citizens, they were sort of aliens. And this helped get on board, some of the Turks who were peaceful and they were friendly with the Greeks. It often got them so incited that they would join in. They would not only not care what was happening to the Greeks, but they would also join in persecuting the Greeks and sometimes actually killing and raping and stealing from the Greeks.
What would you say is the final stage of any genocide?
Well, often scholars claim that denial is the final stage of genocide, but I really disagree with this because by its very public nature, denial often continues to wound both the survivors and their descendants. And it also keeps the memory of those, the survivors and what happened in the public mind. I believe silence is the final killer, because silence eventually wipes away all mention of the victimized people. we forget that they even existed. And so it wipes them from the public record. I remember growing up in New York, there were 40,000 Pontic Greeks supposedly living just across the river in Astoria, New York. And yet no one I had ever met had heard of the Pontic Greeks. And if I mentioned the Assyrians, even teachers told me that the Assyrians didn't exist anymore, that they were an ancient people, and they weren't living in our society. So I wondered, how can I be something that doesn't exist? And this was the consequence of the silence, that no one had spoken about what happened to the Greeks or the Assyrians in Asia Minor for all of those years, until they, in the public memory, they just ceased to exist.
So it's important for people to just know.
It's important to know, and it's important, yes, to make sure that these histories are recorded and that they're recorded accurately. And then, of course, that the public becomes aware of it.
Let's talk about your mother. Beautiful book, and you wrote this with just such a, just a wonderful way. The words you used in the book was just amazing, and just describing her experience was incredible. Tell me about, how your relationship with your mother was.
Oh, we had a very sweet relationship. I've always loved my mother very, very much. She was had such a sweet nature. I remember one time I took her shopping, and this was just, maybe 5 years before she died. So she was already near 100. And I remember we were going into a grocery store, into a supermarket, and a man was approaching the entrance at the same time. And you'd think that she would, go in first. But no, she made this sort of ancient gesture, like this. And she offered him to go before her.
Oh, that's really nice.
And I thought, what a sweet, what a sweet woman she was. She was just always like this. She just had this wonderful, warm, generous nature. You would think, going through so much tragedy in her life and losing everyone she so dearly loved, that she would be angry and hateful but she never allowed herself to do that. She always blamed the Turkish government, never blamed the Turkish people, and always, tried to, just lived her life in such a wonderful, generous way.
You mentioned to me that your mother had told you if she could write, she would have wrote her story.
One of the things that she has always been very, very dedicated to her family and her people. And she used to say that if I could only write, I would tell the world what happened. And I feel very privileged that somehow I was chosen, even though I was a painter all my life, not a writer, but somehow I was chosen to be her voice and tell the world for her.
Such an incredible thing. It's a gift. And it's a beautiful purpose.
Well, I've come to believe that it was fated to be, that somehow she was chosen to survive and to really remember in such detail her history, and that I was somehow chosen to be her voice. And each day we walked further from Karabash until we came to a village, mud brick like the others, only smaller, named Taraz. There, too, the houses were the color of earth, but the windows and doors were not painted white like the other villages. Some houses had little courtyards around them. In the rear of the house, the building seemed to grow out of the earth itself, using a mound of earth for the back wall. There were only 5 houses. We walked from house to house, collecting little bits and pieces that some kind souls gave us. "What a beautiful girl," a woman said, when she opened the door to our knocking. "We are hungry," Mother said. "I have children waiting in the next village with nothing to eat. Can you spare something for them?" It amazed me how Mother could beg and still hold her head high. "Why don't you give this one to me?" the woman said in reply. "You have enough to worry about, and I will take good care of her. She can help with my children." "Oh no," Mother said, "I can't do that. She doesn't belong to me. I'm sorry." "But she looks so much like you," the woman said. "Oh well, if you change your mind, I will take her. At least you won't have to worry about her anymore." She gave us some grain then, and we went on our way. "Why did you say I wasn't yours?" I asked my mother. "I didn't want to hurt her feelings," Mother said. Then she stopped walking and looked into my face. Tears crept into her eyes, and she threw her arms around me and held me to her breast. I couldn't bear to give you away, she said. She held me tightly for some moments before letting me go. I could feel her chest heaving uncontrollably. She held my face against her breast so I couldn't see her tears, but they fell on my head and cheeks like crystallized drops of desert rain. When the sun was low in the sky, Mother sat down on a stone and spread her apron to reveal the food she had gathered for the day. It was barely enough for 2, let alone 6. She stared down at it for a long time as if willing it to multiply. Then she closed her eyes and began to sob. Maybe you should stay with that woman for a while, she said. She'll feed you and then you'll be safe, and I can come back to see you. All right, I said. I don't remember a time when I said no to my mother. Have you decided to leave her then? The woman asked in Turkish when she opened the door. Yes, Mother said, if you promise to take good care of her. Of course, the woman said. Mother turned to me. I will visit you, she said. You must remember how much I love you, how much I love all of you. She wrapped her arms around me and pulled me close, tucking my head between her breasts and kissing me on top of my head over and over again. She held me so tightly I couldn't take a breath, but I melted into her until I couldn't tell where she ended and I began. When she let go, she took the belt she had woven from around her own waist and wrapped it around mine. Again, she pulled me to her breast and held me tight, imprinting my image onto her own body. Again, she let go, and this time walked away without looking back. I stood with the woman in the doorway of her home, watching my mother walk away. Even when the woman went into the house, I still stood there watching my mother grow smaller and smaller until she was no more than a tiny line on the horizon that turned to vapor and disappeared in the waves of heat rising from the ground.
Not even my name. I'm extremely curious to know what that means.
You know, I tried to find a title for it, and then as I was writing, I wrote, a snake had bitten her when she was a child, and she says that I had nothing left, nothing else was left to me, except 2 small scars on my leg, and my memories, not even my name. Because when she was given away by her mother, she was given away to a woman who said that she would take good care of her, but she basically treated her like a slave. And she claimed that she couldn't pronounce her Greek name, Themia, and so she said she named her Sano. So, and that became her name. And so not only was her country, her family, her community, her language even, finally, because she didn't speak Greek again after she lost her family, everything was lost to her, including her name. And so when I wrote that, nothing else was left to me, not even my name, I realized, of course, that's a perfect title for the book.
Not even my name. It's such a strong title, too. You can find Not Even My Name but Thea Halo on Amazon and also on the website HellenicResearchCenter.org. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Wonderful book. Thank you.
In my mother's voice. It's chapter 10, The Year of the Snake. Maybe my mother knew she would never see me again when she gave me away, but I didn't know. I never would have let her go. I would have crawled on my hands and knees for 1,000 miles and faced death 1,000 times to stay by her side if I knew. When she said, maybe you should stay with that woman for a while, I said yes, but only because I never said no to my mother. I loved her too much to say no. Even the Turks loved her. My mother's name was Barthena, but the Turks always called her Gazelle, which means beautiful. And that she was. I loved her even more than that. I loved her more than my own breath.